before you jump in and just recruit, and this is the conversation I have, stop. Just look for a minute to see what is the real problem here you're trying to solve.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Carrie Damon. I'm the Director of Entrepreneurship Programs here at Mars, and I'd like to welcome you to our recruiting lecture, part of our management module. It's interesting that in my time at Mars, I've seen that people tend to flock to events about financing, anything legal, anything about IP, or some of these things, thinking that those are the hard parts of doing a startup. And I think they sometimes think that finding people and recruiting is one of the easier parts because you know there's so much talent around. But I think Margo Crawford, who is going to speak to us today, will talk on some points about why it's so important. And actually, it's a lot harder than it looks. And if you've ever managed at an organization, you realize that good talent is the difference between failure and success in many cases, especially in a startup with limited resources. But before we get to that exciting lecture, I have some announcements. First, a shout out to our webcasting partners at NORCAT in Sudbury and Innovation Factory in Hamilton and Haltech. We do have a number of great events coming up. First of all, we're really excited to bring back our Future Leaders High School Boot Camp, which is a 5-day camp that happens in July. We have had the camp in the last 2 summers, and we've done it for 13 to 15-year-olds. This year, we're expanding to 16 to 18-year-olds because we felt kind of sad not being able to include a number of 16-year-olds that really wanted to be in the program, so we expanded it. We are offering early bird registration this year, so it's only $350 if you apply by May 1st. We are offering a number of bursaries as well, so if you know a teen that's interested in entrepreneurship, or you yourself have a child that you want them to give a little taste of what you're up to, I think it's a great program. It ends with a pitch competition, and we're always really impressed with the students and their ideas. Another announcement for a great program is we have, as part of our ICE area here at Mars that works with software, hardware, media companies, they have an accelerator program called JOLT. The applications for their 2014 summer cohort are open, and the deadline is coming up quickly. It's midnight, March 30th. It's a 6-month program. They invest $50K in your company. There's about 100 mentors. There's space for the company, so they all cohabitat sort of together on the second floor upstairs in the Mars Commons, and there's $600,000 in partner perks. The website is up there. It's joltmarsdd.com, or you can email info@joltco.ca. And lastly, you might have seen in the Globe and Mail, I think today or yesterday, there was an article on this. This is coming up quickly. A lot of countries in the world have anti-spamming legislation. Canada is actually one of the later ones to be on board, and they're coming on very fast with quite stringent legislation. So we're holding a best practices with a team from Miller Thompson, Karen Durrell, and J. Andrew Sprague, and they're going to talk about the potential consequences and penalties for non-compliance with CASL, which is this Canada's anti-spam legislation, and talk about the prohibitions and how they seek compliance. The fines are really heavy, so if you are involved in a startup that sends any kind of email to your customers, check out our session, or if you can't attend on April 16th, the video will be available 3 or 4 days after the session. I think it's pretty important to know about this before it comes in on July 1st. And with that, I'd like to introduce Margo. Margo has been coming to support our program from Ottawa for 5 years, so we thank her for making the trip. And we're very happy to have her because she is a tremendously dynamic speaker, which you will soon realize, and I hope she will convince you about the importance of people and not to overlook how important building a great team is. She has 20-plus years of experience in diverse and challenging environments. She's been recognized as a human resources leader and as a recipient of the prestigious Vision Awards Human Resources Professional of the Year. She co-founded one of Ottawa's most successful startup companies, Meriton Networks, and was instrumental in raising over $75 million in equity financing over an 8-year period. She also led one of the quickest M&A transactions that successfully closed in just over a month. She spent years in different industries, including in the public and nonprofit sectors, where she led management negotiations with several union groups and sat on boards for nonprofit organizations and sports groups. She's a frequent speaker at key industry events, and now she's working on for her own company. She's the president and CEO of the Business Sherpa Group in Ottawa. So with that, I'd like to welcome Margo.
Good evening, everyone. Nice to be here again, and some familiar faces. I'm become part of the woodwork here. And I always enjoy coming to Mars, obviously, to talk about the session, but it's also, in prepping for these sessions, it's a really good exercise for me to reflect on what do I want to share, what's been interesting. And if you've come to some of the sessions before, you know I really try to think about what's coming down the pipe and what's happening in the future. This time I want to take a slightly different approach, and I really thought what I'd like to do is reflect on some of the things that I have been active in and companies that I've been active in. And in particular, looking at the patterns that exist within businesses, opening up that window to everybody's eyes and seeing what's coming down the pipe. And I really connect this very tightly to recruitment and in a really interesting way. So in our business with the Business Sherpa Group, you know, we have a virtualized HR practice. So what we do is we go into companies where they have essentially no HR, and we're often asked to come in and recruit. I just need this. And that's where the conversation begins. And of course, we take care of that. But it is so interesting to start digging a little bit deeper and understanding. So tell me why. What problem are you trying to solve? And it's such an interesting journey that we get involved in. So the neat thing is we're inside of companies of all stages. And, you know, some of you are at one of these stages, hopefully, or will be. You know, we're inside companies that are right at formation. I've taken companies several times at formation and, you know, lived with them and worked with them right through to those early stages of, okay, getting, you know, a first customer, first financing, first sale. And there's always a similar struggle, and it's how we're going to execute on a plan. We have certain outcomes we're looking for, and how do we execute on a plan? And people are always involved in that plan, always, and it's always a struggle. Then we're in companies that are what I would call mature startups. So these are companies that have customers and they've got sales, maybe they're at 5 million or something like that, and you know, they're struggling to get to the next phase, which is, you know, they've got customers they have to support and so on, and now they've got to get to the next window or the next phase of growth, and they're struggling. And it's always about people. Not always, but people are always involved. And then we're also in companies that are very mature. I'm in companies that are 25 years old. They're $50 million businesses. You know, they tend to still be small. I mean, it's amazing what some companies do with 60 people and how successful they are. And, you know, they're trying to get to the next phase. So there's all these business phases that, you know, happen. And they're struggling as well. And at the center of that often is people. So I really thought it'd be interesting to look at those different situations, understand the patterns that happen, and how that connects back to the question of, okay, well, I just need to hire someone. What am I going to do? And really open up that sort of view to everybody and share with you some of the struggles, because I do think if you're going to be building a business, understanding and knowing what's coming down the pipe, what struggles you're going to face, and planning for that makes all the difference. It's what's going to make you successful. And I've actually seen it, I'm doing it, I'm living with it, and it's not easy. It's not easy because it's not just about hiring a person or recruiting a role. So the other thing, so this is the list of topics that I'm going to go through, but the theme I'm going to really bring forward today, and it's one I often use in the companies, it's all about building value. So building value, and what I mean by value, I mean your valuation, is going to be the underlying theme here that I'm going to bring forward, and how important that is as a filter. And I want to walk through all of the things that you ought to be thinking about before we get to the element of, okay, now that you've thought of all these things, how do you recruit well? So it all comes back to that, but I really think it's important to be thinking about these key features, the struggles, as well as how do you actually build value in a company? Because ultimately, if you're not doing that, you really don't have a successful business. So some of the themes I want to talk about: building, sustaining, and transferring value. This is a conversation I have with a lot of business owners. Obviously, the individual and the team competencies. what is your HR resourcing plan? How do you punch above your weight? And I really like that element, that theme, because, I start saying to companies, when do you think you're going to start performing? Are you waiting for something to happen? It's not going to be when you get big, because we know now most companies don't grow to 200 people organizations. A lot stay very successful at 50, 60, and that's a great size to be, and you can perform phenomenally. So let's really figure out how you do smart resourcing. Then once you've thought through those things, how do you hire the best? What do you do to plan for hiring the very best? I am going to touch just briefly, if time allows, just on that general HR checklist, only because that comes back to building value and making sure you've got the right things in place. So it won't necessarily be in this order, but I'm going to touch on all of these topics, and hopefully we'll get some good insights. So building value. This is, it's going to put this in, building, sustaining, and transferring value. So ultimately, when you think about the stakeholders who invest in your company or lend to your company, anyone who's making a decision about your company, ultimately, they care about value. They're thinking about potential that you're going to realize in a product and a technology. And they have some assumptions, and they assume they're going to get something out of it. So the owners and leaders of companies always need to be thinking this way. I have a lot of conversation, particularly with business owners who've been in business for 25 plus years, and they're actually thinking about succession, and they've been working hard at it, and they've been creating great value in their company. And the conversation often goes like this. They don't want to talk about selling their company, but I do say to them, look, at some point in time, you will exit this business. One way or the other is going to happen. And it could be in lots of ways, and it could just be that, out in a coffin. That could be as well. But no matter what, you have to be thinking about what value you've created in your business. And ultimately, I tell them, don't worry about if you're making a decision of whether or not you're selling your company. That really doesn't matter. The point being, if you are thinking about what value you've created, and if that value can sustain itself through a transfer, whether or not you're doing that transfer of the business, that's the state you want to be in. And it's a really good conversation because it gets them starting to think about succession planning. It gets them starting to think about what are the gaps that they have in their organization. And I can tell you, because I sit on this side, I work with investors, and I do this all the time where we're going in and we're evaluating a company. And oftentimes they're investing in the team, they'll tell you that, and it's a big crapshoot, is looking at things that are going to start picking away at the valuation of the company. So a very good example is if the value of the company is completely linked to the owner being around, then your valuation is dropping in a big way. And that's a really good conversation to say, what are you doing to make sure that doesn't happen? So it's a really good filter that I think every business owner, leader, entrepreneur should always have. Even, I've got some really small businesses, and it's a lifestyle business, and they say, we're never selling, we're never going public. I can still say, yes, but this is a good filter for you to have because it's going to bring the value up in your company, and ultimately, then you're going to be operating at your very best. So using this value of thinking, okay, if I had to sell and someone was looking at it, what would be the value of the company? So I really wanted to spend some time on this. This comes a formula from Welch. They're an accounting firm. I do a lot of work with them. And they have a program where they ready companies, a lot of mature companies, for sale because they know there's a lot of aging entrepreneurs who have to exit their business. And they have this formula, which is obviously the value formula. And ultimately, value does equal profit, but not profit alone. The other factors are the sustainability of that profit. So knowing that what you've created so far is repeatable and you can continue it, and ultimately that you can transfer it. So that's the scorecard that really, really matters from another third party. So it's always, again, speaking to what I just said, the metric that's always pulling you to that good spot, which is, what is the value with a sustainable and transferable business? So I like using that quite a bit. And when you make that decision to start a business or invest in the business, ultimately, it's always about taking the current team and the current potential and making something happen with it, that you're taking it and realizing future potential. Someone comes to your business and they invest in it because they believe that it has some future potential that is worth something. And clearly, you create a business for that reason. You believe in something and you know that it has potential to become something, and that's why you create a business. The real wild card, of course, is the ability of that team to realize potential. And it's through these phases, going from current to future potential, and that window of time could be 6 months, that could be 1 year, that can be 10 years. And it can continue to repeat itself. As I mentioned at the outset, we're in businesses that are at formation, that have been around for 6, 7 years, that have been around for 25 years, and they've got different revenue bases, they've got different financials, they're at different stages, but they still struggle through this transfer of getting from current potential or current to future potential, whatever stage. And the wild card often ends up being the team and the people. And that's why I really feel before you jump in and just recruit, and this is the conversation I have, stop. Just look for a minute to see what is the real problem here you're trying to solve. So when you think about the business drivers, like when you start thinking about how does someone size up your business from an investment perspective or an acquisition perspective, or when you're presenting a business plan and thinking, do I actually have a business? These are the types of things that you will be looking at, and they're pretty common. You know, your market external factors, the technology market share, what's the addressable market, what are the barriers to entry, et cetera, your brand, what diversification do you have? And then there's also those operational internal factors, what you can do with that. What's your, what is your reputation that you've built out? What is your sales and marketing capabilities? What are your financial resources? These are all things that you're constantly evaluating from that business in terms of understanding where you're at now and does it have potential. So of course, my view of the world, and this is what I do with some of the due diligence I do with investors to assess a team, to understand the value of the or the potential of the investment, is looking at the human resources factors. So, do you have the team that can actually execute to future potential? And everybody has to take a guess, and you have to take a guess as well as an entrepreneur. You have to wonder, do I have the team around me, and what gaps do I have? What are the resourcing plans and assumptions that are being made? And this is something we poke into quite a lot. I mean, sometimes people are dreaming in Technicolor when they're thinking about some of the resources that they're going to be able to get in a pretty short order, and it's not realistic. So thinking about those elements. What about the team itself? So separating out from the individuals, thinking about the individuals and their competencies, but what about the team mix itself? What gaps do you have on that team? What is missing that's going to be critical? It might not be front and center now, but it's going to be in pretty short order. And that's something that we can look at and understand. And I'm going to talk about some of those problem areas a little bit later. The basics. I will continue to come back to this. The basics are things like your compensation, your employment terms. Do you have the right basics in place that you can grow, retain a team, and develop them? If you've put a lot of effort into building that team, have you put the things and structures in place to make sure that they're going to work for you and not against you? All of the other elements on the basics. Is the company legally compliant? These are just basic things that can easily be overlooked, but can pick away at your valuation. And I've seen it happen. It's just as simple as you don't have your key employees locked into good employment terms, or they're at risk of fleeing with an investment. And while that might be long off, it's still a standard you should rise up to in terms of bringing your team together. Organization and team dynamics. So I can tell you this is the bread and butter of my business, is this piece. And do you have a team that's working together and for progress, or are they working against each other? And I can tell you there's rarely an intention to go in and have a team set up that's working against each other. You're going in with a good honeymoon phase and we're going to do this. But there's business pressures that come into play that create tension. And there's good logical reasons for that. So understanding that and making sure you're addressing root cause problems as opposed to filling the gaps. So this is where I'm brought in a lot to companies to say, I had one in particular where they were just hiring. My first question was, why? Why are you hiring so many people? Is your business growing that much? And the reality is they had so many problems, the quick solution is to throw a bunch of bodies at it. And that's not going to address the underlying problem. And that's why I say thinking about these things and understanding and know that there's dynamics at play is important because you do not, as a small company, have the ability just to hire a lot of people. Those are precious resources. When you think of the limited funds you have, and not just the limited funds, the distraction a wrong person can create in your business it can be profound. I've seen that at play. So these are just some of the drivers. They're business drivers, and it's human resources factors associated with those business drivers. Okay? So talking just a little bit then about your team capability, this is, again, going from that early stage to mature stage, and I was chatting with someone earlier about this, that companies now seem to hold off on doing the right things or making the moves that they should make because I'll call it waiting to grow up, that there's some sort of elusive trigger that's going to signal to them that, okay, now's the time we'll bring this in. We'll wait till then. And of course, you always have to be thinking smartly about where you're going to spend your next dime, but it's very easy to use all of your resourcing, people and money, against the very near term without thinking about and knowing the right time to address some of the longer term fundamental things. And this is where things really fall apart. And the interesting things is I see this in companies at formation in the first year. I see it in companies that are 25 years old. They still don't know when they're growing up. And they're hanging on to old processes and so on. And it's just getting through that phase and being really smart. So with that, I just want to talk about some of the patterns of struggle. One of the privileges of being in a bunch of businesses, and I've been in the last 6 years under the Business Sherpa Group, probably in 50 plus businesses, operational inside these businesses. And the very interesting thing is they're very different. So I've got some that are low tech companies, I've got real estate companies, I have high tech, agribusiness, I've got optical businesses all over the place. I can take these same slides that I'm going to show you here and apply them to any one of those sectors, and they apply. They are the same concepts. So I want to talk about 3 particular struggles I see, and I think these are really important to know about and just be aware of because they create tensions. So the first one is talking about the business inflection points means challenge. It's always tough when you hit one of those inflection points. Fundamentally, you have functions that happen in the organization. You design, develop products or services. You have to define them, obviously. You have to market and sell them. You have to have corporate leadership, and you have to deliver and support whatever you offer. So it doesn't matter what the business is, you have those functions. They happen. Often in the early stage, you have single people doing many of those functions, which makes sense. But over time, that changes. Those needs change. You get a lot of complexities. So really, you do need to think that there's some different skills at different times with different people. And adding bodies is not always the problem. So when you look at it, what happens is the capability of the team over time with these arrows show that at certain inflection points, the capability of the team is going to stay on the lower arrow, or it's going to move up to the upward-facing arrow. And obviously, we always want to be thinking about that arrow that's trajecting upwards. The challenge is as the company grows and becomes more complex and more embedded in the way they operate, the shift from where your team is now to later is more dramatic, much more challenging to do. You've got people who've been operating with you for 10 years, and it's really difficult because there's emotions that come into play. I've talked to a lot of leaders saying, I've had this person for 10 years. And the conversation is like, well, you don't have to get rid of them. There's other alternatives, and there can be a meaningful role for a person. But don't ignore your gaps. Look at your gaps. You've got to figure out a way to fix those because otherwise your business performance is going to take that downward spiral. It's going to do that. So my caution, especially to early stage companies, is know that's going to happen. It's smart and wise to have multiple people doing multiple roles early stage, but don't over-rely on that over time because the problem is going to get worse, not better, and your business is going to suffer. So knowing that those inflection points, and they happen at all sorts of different times, you want to be addressing those, and it gets harder. This is one that I really have used a lot. It's going from early stage to mature stage. I've lived it. I've been in these companies. This was Meriton Networks. I'm supporting businesses now that are going through this. So fundamentally, again, you have those, this is a little bit of not a, more of a product play, not a service, but it still applies. So when you think about what you have to do at an early stage company, you have an addressable market, you have to have a product strategy, you have your operations, you have to design, develop, manufacture, deliver, and support, and you have corporate operations around that, and you have to sell. All of the focus is on those new customers. It's we're going to do everything we have to do to win a customer. Everybody is absolutely aligned and focused. Let's win a customer. And it's very easy, it's very clear about what everyone's got to do. And it's all about new customer wins. What happens in a maturing company, it happens quicker than you realize, is all of a sudden your addressable market is the same, but you've got different conditions. You have existing customers with legacy product. You still are going after new products and new customers, but you also, to compete, have to continually thinking about future products and services. So your team starts to spread out. They can't be singularly focused on those first few customer wins. Someone's got to be thinking about the legacy stuff, and someone's got to be thinking about future. And the reality, if you look at the design and development, I see this a lot, where the design and development team is doing the new customer stuff. They can't spend any time on the future, and they're being dragged into sustaining roles where they've got to support that customer. And largely because the company has not built up a delivery support team, or they're doing it too late. So they're compromising the business. So the impact is these resources start thinning, and they start migrating to where the problems are, versus a balanced view of, okay, we've got to address all of these things. So you're getting pressure from all of these places, and this is very, very true, is the culture of a startup is still focused on winning. Winning, 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 winning. And nothing matters unless you continue to win new customers. Of course that's true. But the fact of the matter is you have to find your business strategy and your design of your workforce that's going to address all of those demands, because if you don't, you're going to start eroding away at your business. There's so much tension that happens. So this is where the honeymoon ends, and that wonderful team where you won the customer and you got the first revenue, and all of a sudden the pressures are building, and guns start pointing inwards, and you've got a team that feels like they're imploding and working against each other as opposed to working with each other. And I just sort of highlight it, that this is a pattern. I can tell you I've seen it over and over and over again, and I think it's just a business condition. You have to be aware of it and plan for it. So again, when you've got that big pressure problem and you're going to recruit, step back, look at what your business structure is and what the business pressures are, and think about, hopefully you'll remember something like this, that you think, okay, this is a natural evolution of a business. It's not because you've got a bad team. It's not because you did it wrong before, but you're going through an inflection point, and you've got to shift, and you've got to adjust, and you've got to plan for that. This one is an add-on to that. It's still in that same phase, but fundamentally the things that I find companies fall down on the most, they do address 1, 2, and 3, okay? So they're still going after the customer wins. They put all their resources and their R&D team out to, okay, they've got customer problems, send the whole team over to wherever to address a customer problem, and you've got someone new. But what they don't focus on well is the transfer, that transfer piece. So how do you take the product, and we see this with stuff that gets manufactured somewhere else, or it's serviced in a different way. 4 and 5, that transfer between what's new and doing it really well to take an idea and make it a realizable product, and also a product that's been built and put into GA and then's moving into a mature product. These are foundational pieces that ultimately, at some point in time, a company has to address. So I think if you're hitting pressure points and you're getting tension and the performance is eroding, it is thinking about 4 and 5. You've got to be thinking about what's happening in that servicing a different condition that your company's in. The last pattern of struggle that I want to talk about is just natural organization structure. Again, this is something that I deal with a lot, and I want to highlight it because I'm sure it plays out. It definitely plays out in companies that are startups. And again, it's a transitional piece. So when you think of this metric or this quadrant diagram here. This is a customer's perspective. So we have new product up on the top, mature existing product down the bottom. From a customer's perspective, the product's late or it's immediate. This is what the customer wants, okay? They want new product, immediate, late, or mature. So you have your sales team, and your sales team will almost always migrate towards, what's new and what's immediate. That's what they're going to sell, right? The newest stuff, the immediate stuff, that's where their natural tendency will drive towards. Then you've got your product design team. Again, this is product-centric, but it does apply to service as well. Okay, so now it's from your design team is what they're going to gravitate is they want it to be fully released. They want it to be when it's ready, and that's a natural tension. You've got sales now, design when it's ready. And of course, this tension does exist in companies. Then we have a whole scheme, which is your whole operation. So finance, delivery, support, they just want certainty. They want it to be precise. They want to know exactly what's happening when. And these are all sort of places that different parts of the organization gravitate towards. What happens, and then in the center of all of that, really you do need your product strategy. Who's negotiating all of this? Yes, I know that sales, you guys want it now, and it's going to be this, but that's not on our product roadmap till next year for good reasons. And so you've got them negotiating all of this and trying to find the business case and the roadmap for the business to build. What happens is, what I see often is product strategy clearly are the entrepreneurs, is who's created the business. So where I see a business where they are selling and their focus is on selling, which is where they go to first, the whole balance gets skewed towards new and now, right? Or if you have a product strategy team that's a bunch of designers or CTOs, they're going to gravitate towards, the beauty of the product and the technology and when it's ready and so on. So I'll go back here. So basically what I'm saying here is that if I go into an organization and I see that you've got an organization that has your CTO, who's also your VP of R&D, who's also your salesperson, which often happens, right? Of course that's the case immediately. But the fact is you really do need these tensions. You need someone pulling towards new and now. You need someone pulling towards when it's ready and done well. You need someone gravitating towards certainty and predictability. So I'm speaking to what that organization ultimately needs. You do need people who own those areas in time. And having one person do it all, they're going to gravitate towards their tendency, their natural tendencies. And that might not be the best thing for the business. So it's just, again, speaking to that organizational dynamic and really being sharp about it. A couple of things that indicate a workforce weakness. Things like I would ask, how many changes have been to your leadership team? Does your organization achieve what you expect it to do, or is it achieving less with more people? That's not good. Are your margins eroding, or are you not getting any margins in your business? So these are all business indicators. And really, are you having no turnover at all and you're a 10-year-old company? That's not good. You need change. So from an investment perspective, what would devalue your business is confidence in your leadership team, succession plans, making sure there's not a single point of failure. Productivity and performance of that team, can they actually deliver, or is it a team that hasn't morphed yet? And so on. I won't go into all of these, but these, you're getting the point, is that when you don't think of these dynamics, it actually depresses the value of your company, and someone will pick away at that valuation. And again, if you keep your focus on, I always want to be in a state where the value of my company is sustainable and transferable, you do need to care about these things. All of this has to be thought about before you actually decide you're going to go and recruit. Okay? So morphing the team. When you're in that point where you say, okay, I get it. I want my team to be on that upper pointing arrow. How do we do that? What do we need to get to a team that's performing to add that extra value? And obviously, it's all the things we just talked about, thinking about solving structural issues. Don't neglect them, think about them, and understand that they come into play. They come into play in performance, into tension on the team, and so on. So understand those things. Smart resourcing. Make sure you're attracting and retain stars. Know who your stars are. what's a star to you in your business, and find them. Don't just be compromising in that regard. You do want stars on your team. And then take care of the business, the basics, so that you're retaining those stars that once you have them. So we don't need to go through this again. I've already beat that dead horse. I've shown this slide many, many times, almost every one of my presentations, the workforce planning mix, so I won't go into it in a lot of detail, but fundamentally what this is suggesting is that you always have all of these milestones you're achieving, and that can be in an early stage company, it can be in a very mature company, and understanding those milestones and whether or not you actually have the team that can deliver on those milestones. You're doing your business a great service to be very honest about that assessment and know before you go and expend one of your critical headcount resources to just a whim. Here's an immediate problem I've got, and I'm just going to go hire this person. Think so carefully because you just don't have many goes at this. So this is a scorecard actually I use in an investor due diligence service that we do. And it's basically, okay, investors, you've got these milestones. You've invested in the business for these reasons. What are the things that you expect out of them? And what's our assessment of the team that currently is there is going to be able to achieve those milestones? Then, what of a slightly modified team? And this is the exact assessment you can do in your business. If I slightly modify this team, and in what way would I modify it? What is the likelihood of achieving those key milestones that have to be hit? And what are the recommendations? And again, it doesn't always take away the aspect that you think you have to move someone out. Don't even let that enter the conversation or the thought process. It's more, we don't need to worry about how we execute on things because there's lots of roles for different people, but really be honest about this. And this is a team strength snapshot. So again, going to those elements of the business that you will always have happening in the business. Obviously, you need someone to lead, support, create, sell, build, deliver. Those are always going to be in the business, and sometimes one person is doing several of these things. So you want to examine, do you have a leader? Does someone actually own one of these areas? And it's shocking. One of the assessments that we do is go into companies and we'll talk individually. It's almost like going in and doing like an investigation and asking them, tell me what you think you own, what you are accountable for. And then we'll go to someone else. What are they accountable for? And what is amazing is how much overlap happens and how many gaps exist where people thought someone else really owned that piece. Having clear ownership of these functions, whether or not it's people owning two of them, is key. And are they accountable for it? Are they actually held to account? It's not just notional ownership. They actually are going to be held to account. And do they have the capability to drive the results for that area? If they don't, it's not that you have to change it up right away, but you need a roadmap for that. If they are not really capable of delivering, at least have a plan. Because at some point in time, it's going to matter. And does the leader know that they are accountable and what the goals are? What are you trying to achieve? And this is a shocking finding often as well, is people sometimes don't quite know exactly what do we have to do. So knowing that very crisply is important. And then fundamentally, are they going to get some sort of reward for delivering? I think that's very important and fundamental. Punching above your weight. The last session I did here last year was talking a lot about how small companies need to punch above their weight, that they have to be able to have core resources and flex resources. And this is just an ongoing reality. It's a condition that we will be in for good. If you're building a business, you're not going to have the beauty of hiring all the resources you need, nor should you. It's not smart resourcing. It's understanding what do you need at your core in those functional areas and what are the flex resources. And what I focused on, and I would encourage you to go and look at some of those, I think the videos are still up on that, on the previous sessions. I was talking about all the technology platforms that are now available that allow companies to resource differently. And I mean, there's people in the room who are developing some of these technology platforms. You don't have to be hiring everything within your organization. There's lots of ways you're going to be able to get resources or find ways to get things done that are not core to your business. So to me, this is smart resourcing. It's a smart workforce planning, and you ought to be leveraging it. So there's a lot on that session from last year on this, so I won't spend time on it, but definitely be thinking about that. And this is just more of the same of thinking about the functional areas. What's your core team and what's your flex team? So plan that way. So again, the question when someone says, I just want to hire someone, I want to have this conversation, and you should be having this conversation as well in terms of your plan, knowing the patterns of struggle that are coming and in the business that are just natural and they will come, knowing that you have to change through inflection points, be smart, smart, smart before you define what you're looking for. So now we get to finding the best. I've also done lots of sessions on recruiting and job descriptions and LinkedIn and social media. Those are available. I don't want to repeat all that. I think we know some of that. I want to get to some basic fundamentals. Once you get to that point, you know it's a core resource. It's critical to now, and it fits with that roadmap into the future. It's going to de-risk our business. And sometimes it's not an obvious rule. Sometimes it's kind of a way out there rule, which often is the case. Now you know you need this. So let's figure out what to do. So this I love because this I hear all the time. So this is all the stuff from Google. This is their website, okay? The ball pit, the climbing wall, the Google pod, and the slide. And everybody's got so much angst because not everybody can be Google, right? And you're like, oh, what do I do? How do you compete with that? You're not going to have a ball pit, okay? It's not going to happen. But what I feel, and I've seen this happen, you can tell your story, and you have to figure it out, and it's compelling. So I just hired, this was a client company of ours in New Jersey. I've just hired a fellow. He's a PhD from MIT in optical, free space optics, okay? Just big brain. And he's been hired, and he was in Bell Labs, and literally they stuck him in a room. Here you go. Just do, go, create. That's all they want. They wanted his brains, and they just create. So I was able to bring him into a small startup, and I'll repeat this again and again. So to him, and I spent a lot of time talking to him, and so when he came into this startup, and he said, you know what sold me in this startup? He goes, to be able to actually see one of the products be put into a box and get shipped to a customer. That was so compelling to him, that ability to go from here's an idea, here's how we're going to create it, realize it. Actually, we're all getting anxious about delivering at the quarter end, and it's actually going into a box. And that was it. That's the story, right? And it's compelling because I can say, hey, you can go to Google and go in the ball pit, but probably you're not going to be, contributing to all of the elements of that full cycle of creation through to delivery, and that's something. So find your story, and it is about doing big things with little resources. It is about saying things from start to finish. It's technology, leading edge technology leadership, and getting complicated puzzles together. So figure out what that story is and use it. You don't have to be Google to offer a neat work environment, and I preach that one a lot. So leading innovation, these are some of the value propositions. So understand that value proposition. And every chance you get, realize that your customers often aren't in the same region where your talent is. So your marketing efforts and your push, if your customers are somewhere else, it's all going to that. But you have a touch point. Every time you recruit, every time you're out there pushing opportunities, that is your touch point with the talent pool. It's the time to tell your story. So I've said this before, having interesting, compelling job descriptions that tell about your story, your value proposition, speaking to them. Don't waste that opportunity. And that can be done in so many different ways in terms of blogging, websites, etc. Don't leave this in the hands. There's times when recruiters are perfectly fine. I use them, I manage them all the time. It's perfectly fine. But when you've got some critical business growth that you need to go, don't abdicate that to someone else. This is so key. And you need to be able to tell your story and put effort into it. So what problem are you solving, and making sure you're clear about that. In terms of, I've done this one before, and I do want to repeat it, it still comes down to the exact same way you market your product, or you think about how you're going to get your product into the market. It's segmenting and understanding the landscape of your resources. Now that you've done this careful thinking about your business and what that next important hire is, and it's a smart resourcing, you're planning ahead, you know it. Now it's your business to figure out who that person is. It is critical to your business to understand who that candidate is and, what do they look like? Imagine the picture. Segment that individual, understand who that person is, and speak to that individual in your job postings, in your interview process, in blogging, whatever you want to do. So you really want to have that clearly spelled out. The messaging then becomes easy because you know your story, you know that perfect candidate. You just need to speak to them. Your messages are around that. You're able to talk to them. Hey, we want someone who's interested in seeing a product come out of someone's head and go into a box and be delivered. If that jazzes you, then you're probably good for our team. And really make sure you're implanting the idea of what your company's offering and so on. So you don't pretend to be a Google. You're just not going to be. And you can do this messaging obviously through your branding that you do in your job postings, etc. You can also do it in your company. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that strategy a little bit later on. And then, of course, last thing is knowing about the channels, knowing the channels of how you're going to reach those candidates. We know now that the channels available to you to reach candidates are extensive. So now I think the real challenge is starting to think about reaching ahead and knowing what you want, knowing who that candidate is, and finding the way to speak to them, whether or not they're looking for a job or they're just passively happy. You've got to find a way to reach that candidate. Okay? Because they're the ones you want, and it's a relationship, it's grooming. And it sounds hard, but it's actually not. I think it's very natural to what your business is about. If you're passionate about your business, I think it's a very natural conversation to have. The next section, this is actually just a repeat of that, so I'm going to skip over that. I just want to talk a little bit about reach and channels. So we know that there's a lot of direct sourcing, and something that we do in a lot of our companies is we do talk, particularly because they're small and they don't have a lot of resources, they don't have a lot of ways of just getting their brand out there. Obviously there's a lot of job boards, but there's very specialized job boards. There's a lot of technology platforms that you can reach those candidates you're looking for. The user groups, and making sure you're connecting with those user groups. There's obviously on LinkedIn, and there's all kinds of, it's just not LinkedIn anymore. There's lots of ways of reaching user groups and communities through technology platforms and all sorts of things. Schools. Schools are a great source. Even if it's not a new grad you're looking for, it's still a phenomenal network. People generally have gone through a school and they've got really good systems and they've got really good reach to their alumni. The relevant associations, networking events that happen, awards of significance. So this is kind of interesting. There's awards that, when you think if you were a candidate, what would be some of the things on your checklist that you would put in your head if you were going to size up an employer? What would be some of the things you're thinking about? Are there any awards that are meaningful? So Profit Hot 50 or something like that. That's the type of company I want to be with, a company who's been that type of success. So think about those things, and they can help elevate not just your brand, but your story and who you are. The indirect sourcing, this is where your team is really involved. And this is where you're getting out in front of your need. This is stuff that you can do all the time, well ahead of the time when you actually need to recruit, and it's stuff that you can be doing all the time. And it's just elevating your presence, awareness in that potential market that you need to hit at some point in time, making sure they know your story. So when I say job boards here, I'm thinking more around, if there's job boards and you're not really recruiting, you can still place banner ads up there, so you're starting to get your presence known. I haven't used banner ads a whole lot in small companies. It's just not affordable, frankly, but that's something that you can do. But your user groups, particularly with your team, what communities do they join? What networks do they join? What forums are they part of? And making sure they're active in those forums, because that just establishes a network. And it's as simple as a tweet then. Once that network is established, saying, hey, we're looking for something when that time comes. But making yourself active and letting people in that community know about you just by participating. Participating in a forum that's useful for your business, it's creating your awareness. Same thing with schools. Again, that networking and working with the schools and the alumni associations. Again, this is outside of the direct I have a need. This is indirect. We're just we want people to know we're on we want to be on people's radar. And you can do this just by being active about your company. And it's, again, this is a really nice and natural piece because it aligns to your business anyway. You know, you're talking about your business to the right communities, and ultimately, that's probably where your talent pool is too. So doing and being active in those is important. So networking events that happen in sort of those high-value networking events that the company, you know, speaking engagements and so on. You know, there's some conferences that you might be participating in, and being active in those and having speaking events. You might not have a booth or whatever, but, you know, being involved. And again, raising the awareness, particularly where it's a very targeted conference or event, that equally is your community that you want to reach eventually. You want them to know about you. It's the beginning of the relationship. And again, awards of significance for the company. In the tech sector, there might be some really high prestigious tech awards that a candidate equally is going to say, hey, I like a company that's gotten that award. So pursuing some of those things is that indirect kind of raising the tide for your company so that when you do need to recruit, you've already been actively engaged in the community that you want to reach into. And to me, that actually serves the dual purpose of, you know, working for your business anyway. Tight execution obviously is the key. Knowing that once you do have to hire, talked about this lots, you're not going to hire someone in a week. It's not going to happen. Plan 2 months. Know it's going to be 2 months. And 2 months actually is things going pretty perfect when you think about when you have to have someone in seat. All right, so work backwards from that at least and know that that's what you need to be doing. Just very quickly, taking care of the basics. This is kind of not dull stuff, but it's one of those things where eventually, once we've sort of sorted out some things, we're always going to talk through these pieces, and knowing that things like your contracts, making sure you've got good contracts. Even when you have one employee, you want to protect your IP, you want to protect confidentiality, you want to make sure you've got the appropriate liabilities and you've mitigated risk in those contracts. So it's simple. I mean, even if you spend, you know, $500 for one template agreement with a law firm, so you've got it in place, it's money well spent. Compensation. So this is always hard, but you ultimately have to be thinking about compensation, whether or not you've got cash or you've got equity. You want to plan around that. Don't do it sort of scattered. Don't just, you know, do it willingly. Put some thought into it, and it doesn't have to be complicated or heavy, but just know that you've got more hiring that you're doing other than what's right now. That will happen. Believe that, and plan around it. Sales incentives. This is something that comes into play for sure eventually. It's always a struggle when it's a pre-revenue company, but I still think having targets and things that are increasing the value of the company, even if it's not revenues, can be a reasonable sales incentive target. And it should always be around, I've often said, look, if you had to go and pitch to an investor or if you had to speak to the board, what accomplishments would you put up there that they would equate as being valuable? Well, those should be the incentives that you put on your sales team, even if it's not revenues. Policies sounds horribly dull, but there's laws that you have to comply with. And again, if we're talking about valuation of your company, these are the little things that an acquirer will pick away at and lower the value of your company. And it's simple to take care of. Just take care of them. And there's lots of ways to take care of that. And obviously, we've talked about workforce planning and recruitment, thinking through it and really knowing your blind spots, knowing what's coming to, and just having a plan. You don't have to do it all, but have a plan and have something that you can speak to of how you're going to manage that. So when someone like me comes in to evaluate your company for an investor, and I know that that's a problem, if you've got a story around that, that's good enough. It's showing that you're thinking about it and you know it's there and you've got a plan. And then performance management. Again, effective feedback, knowing what you have to be doing, having alignment. It sounds perfunctory, but it's really critical to your business. And it doesn't, again, I don't mean you need this big, long 10-page form. It can be as simple as you've got a one-page dashboard on your employees. Here's what I expect. Here's what's not happening. Here's what we need to have happen. That's good enough. So just something simple is good enough. So I think that's it. It is. And we have still a few minutes for questions. I'm hoping that what I've done is really opened that window to what the future will be. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that these patterns do happen, these problems do exist, and just thinking about it and having a plan is going to put you so much further ahead than being surprised and shocked when all of a sudden things are imploding inside. And I can't emphasize enough how much you need to be planning and thinking and carefully resourcing every time you've got one of those critical resources and you're going to spend money. Ultimately, even if you've got a free resource, which I'm not a big fan of, people probably who've been here before know that. You know, when you have one of those critical resources, you are being so smart. You're balancing the near-term problem, you're balancing the long-term growth and the valuation of your company, and always keep that front and center. So I'll open it up to questions, and hopefully that was something that was useful and helpful and you enjoyed. Thank you.
We do have 2 mics in the aisles. If you have questions, please use one of the mics. We do have 2 questions by webcast, actually.
Okay.
The first one is, for a startup with limited cash flow, should we consider giving a candidate equity rights at the onset to hire him or her, or is that too risky?
They have no cash, they have, sorry?
With limited cash flow, should they consider giving a candidate equity right away at the onset to hire him or her, or is that too risky versus, I guess, a full salary?
I wouldn't say do it as opposed to salary. In my mind, if you can't afford to pay someone, even something nominally, then, I mean, obviously it's a strategy of hiring, but the problem with that is that it's not necessarily creating good behaviors and habits around managing that resource and expectations. It becomes very slippery. So if you have equity and you want to offset a salary, I think it is something you can do. I would do that with a plan again. The thing I find with equity is people don't give it a lot of thought, and they just toss out equity, and you know, it's something that you can assume you're going to grow and you've got a limited pool and plan that resource. Don't just give it away and think about it.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
When you were showing the slide with the number of phases where
Yeah.
the kind of people you would get, under organizational milestones, you had early on, you had sales in brackets, hunters, and then later on sales in brackets, farmers. I have a sense of what it might be, but I'd like to hear
Sure.
how you define that and why they are where they are.
So, I mean, there are different conditions for different companies. So generally speaking, when a company decides that they're actually going to hire a salesperson as opposed to the CEO selling, which is where that starts, it's a very sort of evolutionary sell, and when they actually have to hire someone, oftentimes really what you need in an early stage company is you need to close business. You need someone who's going to be able to, and it could be still a long selling cycle, but they've got tenacity and they're driven to close. They want to get a closure. And oftentimes what I find in a lot of startups is that very few times is that CEO salesperson a true closer. They're more about building the relationship, convincing people about their company, they're inspirational, and they feel a bit squeamish about pushing to close, and they know that. And so that often ends up being the big gap, that they need someone who can really, really take this and put it over the line. And the reason why I put it first is that becomes the first problem. Ultimately, you need both. And I put farmer later because at some point in time, a farmer is going to be someone who's going to get repeat sales, who's going to nurture an account management. And so it naturally happens later. And really, they are very different people, right? Someone who's a hunter who wants to close, they're going to close business. And the problem is then they're going to just, okay, bye, and they're on to the next thing. So you need someone grabbing that and doing something with it and delivering it. So in the early stages, that can be your team that you have. Later on, that might be someone who is a farmer or an account manager who's going to make sure it's all taken care of and they're going to get repeat sales. So it's just kind of the natural progression, but really they're very different people.
And with the farmers, besides repeat sales, are they thinking of the farming analogy? Are they also the ones that are going to then bring in other customers because they're satisfied and therefore they're going to sow seeds?
That's right.
Of future customers.
Exactly. So they just tend to be much more, I don't want to say that salespeople aren't relationship builders. They are all relationship builders, but it was their natural tendency to, gently sow seeds, gently go after business, bring stuff in, make sure that the repeat sales are happening, and continue that great relationship with that customer who, yes, can bring in more business and is developing that longer-term relationship. Whereas if you need new customers coming into your pipeline, and often you do, the farmer's going to be tending to want to stick with the existing relationship that they've built. They're not out there going after every stone. They don't want to leave that relationship. They're going to be, you want that person who's, turning over every stone for new business.
Great.
So
Thanks.
really different people.
Thank you.
Sorry, we have one more question by
Okay.
webcast before we jump to you.
Sure.
How would you deal with skilled talent on the team that may not be as motivated as the rest of the team and is not responsive and lagging behind on deadlines and tasks?
Well, I have a quick answer, but it's not always viable. So obviously, in a small company, you have a very limited window to address non-performers. But I would say, and I've dealt with this, is that the first thing I would do, and I've advised several managers, is look at if someone's really lagging and they're really pulling your team down, you have to deal with it. You cannot let it just persist. You have to do something about it. And presumably they've got something to offer. I always say, look, have the conversation with this person, and don't be gentle. Be very clear that what's happening and that they're not, and why it's a problem for the company and why they have to change. And they need to change in the next 2 weeks because you don't have the luxury of 3 months. You have to make that change happen. So I call it kind of slap up the side of the head conversation. And it's literally, you have to be very clear that this is not working, why it's not working, why it's making the team suffer, what needs to change. And I often tell them, saying, tell this person to go home and come back after the weekend with a plan of how they're going to change. And check in, and make it very tight. But you have to deal with it crisply.
Laura?
Hi, I'll echo Peter's sentiment. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Question. There are different schools of thought. Some people say, yes, it's fine to hire friends, and some people say, no, don't go there. So my question is, what happens if a friend happens to have if you go down all the qualifications that you need and you can tick all the boxes, they've got all the right stuff, even when you compare them to someone who's not a friend. So you've checked other candidates and you've measured them against this other one. If I like and I know and I trust and I know down in the trenches from working with them that I can trust them, my gut tells me go with a friend if they meet all the other requirements, including working for Google, by the way. What would you suggest?
I would suggest that if you've really done that diligence, I don't think there's a rule of thumb that says don't. The only time I say don't do that is if there's a relationship, obviously.
Of course.
So, but if it is a friend and they do meet that, you obviously can proceed. However, I would be really clear about we need to talk about our rules of engagement in the workplace. And we need to know each other's blind spots.
Right.
And I would actually create a mechanism so someone else can point out those blind spots. So it's not just between the two of you.
Okay.
You almost put someone in the role of, we need to make sure that we're steering clear of, a dysfunctional situation.
Or anything that could be compromising.
Yeah.
Okay.
And to me, it's just allowing you to still leverage that talent, which you want to do, and trust. I think that's a great thing. Mm-hmm. But, have that candid conversation and set up a mechanism that allows someone to safely come to you saying, you guys are too cozy and everyone's feeling outside of your nice relationship you have.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yes.
Hi. My question is, when you mentioned that in the initial stage of a business where you have sort of the jack of all trade, later on you need to specialize, kind of peel them off and be really in touch with what their natural tendency is. So quote unquote, if they're a hunter, you want to obviously put them in that kind of role. My question is, when you are peeling off tasks from them, how do you manage the expectation that they might feel insignificant or less important? And also, second part, once you have segmented them, what happens if they relapse and they really want to rejoin another segment? They say, you know what,
I kind of like
that part of my job before. How do you deal with that?
Right. So I have dealt with that in lots of cases. And, it's a human interaction, so it's never easy, but my view is that if you're at a point where you really need to start peeling off, and I'm not saying rush into these things. I mean, the fact is you have to operate a business on a pretty lean budget for a long time. So hopefully it's so painful, they're only happy that you've peeled off something. And really that's probably the state that you're in. And doing that with them and talking to them that this is the plan. I also think going back to planning and knowing what you're doing in the future and having that plan laid out from and look, we don't know when we're going to execute on this, but for the business, it's right for us to get to this point. So that conversation becomes easier. It's not kind of, well, what's this? Why are you doing this? It's that roadmap and sharing that roadmap of where the organization must get to and sharing that with everybody so they understand that they're not being diminished, that in fact we're at the state we've got to do this, and have the conversation. It's not helpful if you retrench. Now, if someone does retrench, then I think there's just if you've done that work, and I really recommend just showing your roadmap to people and saying, in the future, it's going to look like this. And eventually, there's going to be pieces you're not going to be doing. That's what we have to get to. Having that conversation and why it's important that they do that piece well. I mean, obviously, it should be a meaningful role, and it will be if you've planned well. But I really think having that vision and that view well ahead of the conversation is the best way to manage that situation. And then you're not dealing with expectations that are let down.
Thank you.
Okay.
We are, Margo, we are out of time, unfortunately, but will you be around for questions after?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, very much for coming. Thank you, Margo.
Okay.